In 2006, the Swedish indie pop rock band Peter, Bjorn and John released a catchy whistle duet with the title Young Folks. The song was met with wide critical acclaim, and as of this writing, the animated music video by Graham Samuels has garnered over 45.5 million views on YouTube. The cartoon features two pale white youths, a long blonde-haired woman and a shaggy dark-haired man who in the opening of the video sit together on a park bench whistling. Their clothing and style is plain and somewhat conservative. They both wear button-down collared shirts. She sports a skirt and sandals. He's got on trousers and might be wearing Chucks. The shot cuts to a bus where the pair nods along to the beat. Again we jump, this time to an unremarkable living room where the protagonists are now joined by a backing band as they work out a new song. In the second statement of the chorus, the visuals get only slightly funkier with some pseudo-psychedelic swirling. This precedes a subdued party scene where the band plays in their sitting room. In the lyrics of the verse, the dude asks a series of, "If I did this, would you?" questions that address past dalliances. The woman ultimately answers, "We could stick around and see the night through," a line that's more sexually suggestive than any of the imagery presented in the video. The chorus features a series of repetitive, "we don't care about" statements, expressing a general carefree attitude. The punchline seems to be an assertion of what some might hear as unsurprising teenage narcissism with sexually charged undertones. All we care about is talking, talking only me and you. The rendering of youth in Young Folks is carefree and privileged, but rather drab. These youths don't seem to have jobs, but they do have access to space, instruments, and recording gear, and a group of mostly homogeneous friends. The music is dominated by the whistled pentatonic melody. Is this ironically distanced parlor reverie what happens when musicians in their early 30s imagine young folks? In this paper, I am interested in the question of how popular music communicates ideas about youth. Within popular music scholarship, youth tends to connote post-World War II genres. Often used synonymously with teen, the concept is linked to 1950s consumer culture and attendant notions of rebellion, trouble, and triviality. This paper traces instead a long history of youth in U.S. popular music. Indeed, youth featured importantly in the 18th and 19th centuries too. I'll show some of the ways the idea of youth functioned historically, asking who claimed youthfulness and for whom. And finally, I'll connect how this might relate to much more contemporary assertions of the young and youth in popular music, such as the young folk song described above. To the best of my knowledge, the topic of youth in early pop music has yet to be analyzed or discussed within our field. For a bit of context, the abstract attached to this presentation started as an overview for a panel on youth in early pop music for the Museum of Popular Culture's annual conference in Seattle. Many of you will already know that this year's conference theme is youth. The panel didn't come together, but I realized that the overview I'd researched and written warranted further attention. My presentation today is the start of this new work. It is somewhat of an archival show and tell that at this point has come together exclusively from resources that were available online, but I try also to point to the limitations and silences that this archive highlights. Nicholas Tawa writes, quote, "Youth was undeniably the time of least responsibilities and greatest leisure, at least for the middle class. It follows that the pre-marriage years were also the time for musical studies, if they were to be undertaken at all. Young men and women did study singing and acquire sufficient command of the keyboard to execute the easy accompaniments of the compositions they sang. One hastens to add that when amateur performers from the latter part of the 18th and first half of the 19th century are named, they are more often unmarried women under 21 years of age." End quote. In this first section, Songs for Youth, I trace the ways that music publishers across the long 19th century address their young audiences specifically. In these examples, publishers from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia used the designation young to modify categories of musical consumers: young masons, young minstrels, and young folks. The publications are meant as practical or instructive, and the texts contained within them affirm the concerns of white middle and upper class literate youths and reflect dominant economic and ideological systems. The first example I found of a youth-addressed publication comes from a 1789 songster published in New York with the title The Young Mason's Monitor. Songsters of this kind were commonplace across the 18th century and well into the 19th century, and many of the earliest songsters were published by Masons. In his bibliographic study of songsters printed in America before 1821, Irving Lowens notes that the first publication of something called a songster in 1734 was by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia. The Young Mason's Monitor was first published by Harrison and Purdy in New York in 1789 by Brother William M. Stewart. This version was advertised in the New York Weekly Museum from the 15th of August through to the 31st of October in 1789, but no extant copy survives. Another version with the same title appeared 2 years later in 1791 in Providence, Rhode Island. B. Wheeler, the secretary of St. John's Lodge No. 1 in Providence, compiled this Young Mason's Monitor. It is 46 pages long and contains 27 songs. The cover is shown here, and the texts exist in digital transcription in the University of Michigan's Evans Early American Imprint Collection. The Young Mason's Monitor addresses youthful male singing members of Masonic societies and includes an address, prudentials, the charge to brethren, and a collection of 27 Masonic songs and odes, which are interspersed with toasts. The tunes aren't named, but the song texts speak of the bonds of fraternity, brotherhood, equality, and love. In general, they reinforce the false promises of the Founding Fathers, and in singing them together as part of their rituals, these young Masons sounded out patriarchal domination. From the mid-19th century, music education texts suggest their intended audience. Pianist Artemus N. Johnson published The Young Minstrel in Boston in 1843. The 216-page volume contains song scores arranged for 3 vocal parts. The preface explains that, quote, most of the pieces in the following pages are so arranged that they may be sung in either 1, 2, or 3 parts. It is taken for granted that the teacher who uses this work is already acquainted with the elementary principles of music. Consequently, that department of this work is not designed as a guide to the teacher, but is only to be regarded as a course of instruction which can be varied from at the pleasure of the teacher, end quote. The Young Minstrel includes popular tunes such as Auld Lang Syne, Home Sweet Home, and Oft in the Stilly Night. Most of the songs are secular songs of home and nature, but this volume does include a handful of hymns. The edition here was published in 1848, several years after the original. It contains a foreword by the Masons of the Public Grammar Schools of Providence. It reads, we take pleasure in commending to the attention of teachers and school committees The Young Minstrel by Johnson and White, a book which has been in use in our schools for some time past, and which we find to be a work of superior merit. We have from time to time become acquainted with a considerable number of juvenile singing books, but we know of no other which combines so eminent a degree of the chief requisites of a music book for common schools, namely, good instruction, good exercises, good songs, and good tunes. Such we believe to be the character of this book throughout. Most singing books contain a few good tunes, mingled with a great number of others so destitute of any merit that they are never sung. The Young Minstrel contains a large number of the best class of tunes, while all, or very neatly all, are such as will be sung with interest in schools, end quote. In 1856, Oliver Ditson and Sons of Boston published The Young Folks Glee Book by Philadelphian pianist and composer Charles Wesley Jarvis. The cover boasts that the collection consists of, quote, nearly 100 copyright songs and duets, never before harmonized, and the choicest gems from the German and Italian, the whole arranged in a familiar style for the use of singing classes, glee clubs, and the social circle, end quote. A prefatory page goes on to explain that the words of the songs, duets, etc. are elevated in sentiment and adapted to the feelings and desires of the great mass of the people. In a word, the Young Folks Glee Book is intended to be superior in every particular. Inside are 4-part vocal scores for an array of songs by composers, including Donizetti, Bellini, Schubert, and Mozart, which are interspersed with songs by Ossian Dodge and compiler Charles Jarvis himself. Song themes address patriotism, such as The Free Country by the Rayner Family, Political songs as in $8 a Day by J.J. Hutchinson of the abolitionist singing group the Hutchinson Family Singers, nostalgic youth songs, including Where Are the Friends of My Youth by George Barker. This includes the performance note With Emotion, and many, many home songs. Education and music education more specifically were not, however, available to a great mass of people. They depended on money and leisure time, which came at the expense of those of lower social standing. Christopher Lynch explains that this was certainly the case for the young Stephen Foster, who I'll discuss shortly in a different context. Lynch quotes in an 1841 letter in which William Sr. wrote to William Jr. about young Stephen, quote, "His leisure hours are all devoted to music, for which he possesses a strange talent," end quote. And finally, the many home songs within these collections assert an idealized notion of home as stable, secure, and comforting. And this ideal was certainly not available to the great mass of the people. From 1865 to 1873, Ticknor and Fields of Boston published a monthly children's periodical filled with articles and music. Our Young Folks was aimed at an audience of 10 to 18-year-olds and circulated to over 76,000 readers at its peak. In a dissertation analyzing the 51 pieces of music included in Our Young Folks, Mary Yonts explains that the magazine featured a few pieces by Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert, a significant number of compositions by music education arranger and composer Julius Eichberg, and a high percentage of female named lyricists. Yonts explains that, quote, "The history of American music education is relevant, particularly because Our Young Folks was published in Boston, where music was first included in the curriculum of an American public school system in 1838, end quote. A feature section of the magazine titled Round the Evening Lamp offered programmatic and vocal music with moderately difficult writing for the piano and adult vocal ranges. Yonts interprets this as an indication of positive multi-generational engagement in music, that, quote, "Parents and children perform music together in the middle and upper class homes of 19th century America," end quote. Young composers were urged to submit their own compositions to Our Young Folks. The 9th volume features the Apple Blossom Waltz by Sophie Oliver, age 14. Thematically, the songs focus on nature and out of doors. They do not speak of love for the opposite sex, and in contrast with the previous examples, only 3 of the musical works are set in the home. The interest in nature topics, Yonts explains, quote, "may reflect nostalgia for the rural lifestyle which was disappearing in that era of widespread urbanization," end quote. Yonts doesn't mention the possibility that cultivating in educated middle-class youth a sense of connection with, and even domination over the land, served the interests of westward expansion, manifest destiny, and the genocidal program of settler colonialism. In this next section, I'll offer a very brief gloss of just some of the 19th century songs that I've found about the topic of youth, and then consider a case study in more detail. The sheet music for these songs announces its relationship to youth or youngness in bold font. While it's tempting to think of these as cultivated songs of the parlor tradition, it's important to note that many of these songs circulated widely without notation as broadsides, in dime novels, and of course orally in performance settings and more informal ones. So I've compiled here a number of these covers. You'll see on the left, Scenes of My Youth, in the middle, Dreams of Youth, and on the right, Oh Days of Youth. Scenes of My Youth is from the Romantic era, The Gypsy's Warning by Jules Benedict, and this is a song of mourning over death. And the protagonist sings, "Home of my childhood, from thee I have fled." The next song is a comic song. This was He Was Such a Nice Young Man, written by R.W. Aldridge, and the music composed and arranged by M.T.A. Becker. This song is sung from the perspective of a young woman who has a romantic tryst with a young man, and he turns out to be a thief. And then here I've got the previously mentioned Where Are the Friends of My Youth by George Barker. This is a tender and sad song in which the protagonist sings, "Why have they left me to mourn?" In addition to these songs that announce their relationship to youth and youngness in their titles, and there are many more, and on the sheet music title pages, two other songs are worthy of mention because of the fact that they were especially popular tunes. The protagonist of Henry Russell's Woodman Spare That Tree from 1837, and the aged couple in James Austin Butterfield's When You and I Were Young, Maggie from 1866, showcase sentimental song lyrics that glance longingly backwards, referring to youth as a nostalgic phase. And here's where things get really interesting, with a minstrel song by the title of Young Folks at Home. I haven't been able to find any scholarly references to this song, but I have found two editions of the score, both of which list 1852 as the copyright date. Goldenberry at 297 Broadway in New York published the first edition. The second copy is marked 13th edition, and it appears that by this point Goldenberry had changed configuration. T.S. Berry remained at that same address in New York, and J.E. Gold had relocated to Philadelphia. The sheet music cover announces Frank Spencer as the song's lyricist, Miss Hattie Livingston as composer, and Wood's Minstrels as the performers. It reads, written and composed expressly for Wood's Minstrels, Minstrels Hall, 444 Broadway. The song passes the popularity test from the method outlined by Paul Sharash in his work on 19th century songs. In addition to the two editions I just mentioned, Young Folks appears in manuscript books, dime collections, broadsides, newspaper advertisements, and binders volumes. For those who aren't familiar, this practice shows 19th century women collecting single pieces of sheet music and then binding them into large volumes, often around the time of an important life event such as marriage or the birth of a child. These collections were kept as family heirlooms and passed on to subsequent generations. Music books or binders volumes were extremely popular during the years 1830 to 1870, and these personal collections of bound published sheet music titles were assembled by young women primarily during their adolescent years, when musical training and accomplishment was sought after as a reflection of cultural refinement and gentility, as Candace Bailey has documented. I've listed here the examples of the binders volumes in which we find copies of Young Folks at Home. These include Belle Judson's volume, H&M Sewell's volume, and Esther Baker's volume of American Music. A manuscript book of songs published between 1852 and 1856 belonging to one Celesta A. Collins mentions Young Folks. Henry de Marsan, an important New York ephemera printer, published American Ballads of the 19th Century that features the song, and it is the first song listed in Wood's Minstrels Songs, containing a selection of the most popular choruses, quartets, glees, trios, duets, songs, parodies, burlesques, etc., and also funny stories, satirical jokes, quaint sayings, conundrums, repartees, etc., as told by the celebrated E. Horn at Wood's Minstrel Hall. The song also appears as a broadside without music notation, and I've got two versions of those broadsides here. Finally, newspapers, including the Daily American Telegraph in D.C., advertised the sale of the sheet music. Young Folks at Home is somewhat of a mystery. It is clearly an answer song to composer Stephen Foster's smash hit Old Folks at Home from 1851. For context, Judith Tick explains that by 1852, Foster's Old Folks had sold approximately 40,000 copies, at a time when 3,000 to 5,000 copies of a song made it a hit. Answer songs were a common strategy songwriters used to try to capitalize on the success of their referent. The Young Folks score is for solo voice with piano accompaniment and a quartet chorus for tenor, alto, soprano, and bass. The words are written in first person, and as expected from a minstrel song of this period, they are in dialect. Like Old Folks, the song is sung from the perspective of an enslaved character who longs to return to the young folks at home. I'll play here a MIDI version of the music that I found online and show the lyrics to the first verse and the chorus with the dialect. music on banjo and tambourine. The third verse refers to poor Tom, and the final verse uses the phrase cold, cold grave, a reference to Foster's Masses in the Cold Ground from July 1852. For comparison to Foster's Old Folks, here's a short excerpt of Paul Robeson's 1930 recording of Old Folks.
Way down upon the Swanee River, far, far away, there's where my heart in turning ever, there's where the old folks stay. All up and down the whole creation, sadly I roam, still longing for that old plantation and for the old folks at home.
Lyricist Frank Spencer's name shows up on a number of earlier and later minstrel songs, although I have yet to find additional information about him. But beyond this one song, I have been unable to find any other reference to a composer by the name of Miss Hattie Livingston. While there is a lot about 19th century music culture that remains undocumented, it is quite unusual. It is quite an unusual situation to find no other hint of a composer's name for a song that, as the evidence presented above suggests, was indeed quite popular. Right now, my suspicion is that Hattie Livingston was in fact a pseudonym generated by a male composer. It was not uncommon during the 19th century to use a pseudonym for publication purposes, and the situation of a man borrowing a woman's name is unusual, but not entirely unique. Philadelphia composer Septimus Winter would rather famously adopt his pseudonym Alice Hawthorne just a few years after the publication of Young Folks. Winter ended up developing an entire persona around Hawthorne and published concurrently under her name for over 30 years. In the case of Young Folks, the reason to do so comes from the gendered idea that a woman has a more authentic access to emotional connection. Miss Hattie Livingston would have likely been imagined as a white Northern sympathizer, and the song as part of the broader abolitionist movement. In 1851, 1 year before the publication of Young Folks at Home, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin started its serial publication in the National Era abolitionist periodical, before going on to become the most important novel of the 19th century. Like many Harriets, Stowe was referred to as Hattie. The Tom I referred to from the third verse of Young Folks at Home refers to the title character of Stowe's novel. It also seems noteworthy that at this time, the Woods minstrels from the title page shared a performance space with the Christie minstrels, who are credited on the title page of Foster's Old Folks at Home. The connections between Young Folks at Home and Old Folks at Home run deeper than commercial answer song opportunism or being associated with minstrel troupes under the same roof. Young Folks also participates in the trend identified with Foster's songwriting towards representing the interior emotional life of its enslaved character. This era of Foster's work is fascinating, and scholars have not agreed on how to interpret the meaning of expressing what Christopher Lynch refers to as an imagined black perspective. Was he converting to abolitionist politics by offering a public emotional life to the enslaved, as Charles Hamm and others have suggested? Or just following the trend of adjusting his language to maximize sheet music sales like Christie was with his minstrel shows, as Stephen Saunders argues? Plantation songs, regardless of the composer's intention, were performed by abolitionist singing groups, used in stagings of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and even championed by Frederick Douglass. Christopher Lynch explains that Douglass addressed the Ladies' Anti-Slavery Society of Rochester in 1855 with the following: "These heart songs, quote, can make the heart sad as well as merry, and can call forth a tear as well as a smile. They awaken the sympathies for the slave, in which anti-slavery principles take root, grow, and flourish." End quote. If my theory about the 1852 young folks proves correct, its composer ventriloquized twice, writing the song from an imagined enslaved perspective and stamping it with the name of a fictional northern white woman sympathizer, a double erasure of authoring someone else's experience and then capitalizing from them. Finally, the young here implicates, by either absence or projection of fantasy, what historian Wilma King refers to as the stolen youths of the enslaved. King argues that, quote, "enslaved children had virtually no childhood because they entered the workplace early and were more readily subjected to arbitrary plantation authority, punishments, and separations. These experiences made them grow old before their time." End quote. There's certainly much more to say on any one of these examples and its context. I've painted in very broad strokes here. By taking this long historical view, I do not mean to suggest that the concept of youth as represented in popular song is static, nor do I mean to impose a transhistorical notion of the youth. Instead, I ask us to consider how what media studies scholar Lisa Gittleman refers to as the always already new paradigm of media studies applies to popular music as media. And I take seriously musicologist Matthew Morrison's call to consider long histories as a way of unsettling, or at least calling attention to, white cultural priorities in music studies. It's not just that these early pop songs mention youth, but instead that they use music to stake out a particular yet familiar notion of youth that isn't necessarily widely shared. Unsurprisingly, the examples included here prioritize white experiences and feelings. They co-opt youth as privileged space of white leisure, and this racialized legacy of imagined youth persists. Let's return to the 2006 young folks. Like their predecessors, our two white youths demonstrate their connections to nature, their leisure time for making music, and their domestically secure and presumably soundproof place in which to play. They too co-opt youth on behalf of all ironic privileged white youths, thus participating in a long history of erasure.